the question that I want to consider with you is, why is this here? It's only in Matthew's gospel, Matthew the tax collector, which maybe he was particularly interested in this tax that was being collected. But here's what we need to know about Jesus' miracles. All of them were signs. They signified something about who he was and the kind of kingdom he intended to bring. And whenever we see one of these miracles make it into the gospel account, it is there for a reason. You know that at the end of John's gospel, it says that if they were to have written down everything that Jesus done, there would not be room in the whole world to contain the books that would be written about him. This one matters. It looks like a small miracle, but it has a big message. In fact, if I'm being honest with you, it's bigger than I thought, than when I originally started studying this passage. In fact, I gave a title to this passage for my sermon that really had to change the more I looked at it. Because the more I dug into this, it was something entirely different than I even thought that it was. So, you guys want to look at a weird miracle of Jesus together? All right, let's take a look. In chapter 17, starting in verse 24, here's what we read. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we have to understand who these men were, what was the tax they were collecting, and why did they care whether or not Jesus paid it? Ordinarily, when you hear about tax collectors, especially in the gospel narrative, they are not the good guys, okay? They are national traitors. They were not good people. They were cheaters and swindlers, and they were collecting a Roman tax from the Jewish people, and they inflated what they actually owed so they could get rich on their backs. They were despised. But that's not who these people were. See, these were not traitors. These, in fact, were faithful Jewish men. And they were not collecting a Roman tax. They were collecting something called the temple tax. Do you know what this is? I suspect that many of us don't, because I didn't really know what it was either. In Exodus chapter 30, in 11 through 16, this is around the time that Moses is up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, receiving the 10 Commandments from God, along with a whole other bunch of instructions for the people of God. In chapter 30, verse 11, God gives this institution of a new tax that is to be paid by his people. And we're not going to go there. You can go there later if you want. But I'm just going to give you a summary of what it says. He says, "Moses, I want you to take a census. And every male that is over 20 years old, they are to give this offering as a ransom for their life." Do you know what a ransom is? A ransom is a sum of money that is demanded or paid for the release of a prisoner. God is saying this offering that they are to give, it is a ransom. The very existence of this tax and the fact that God levied it on his own people is an acknowledgement by the people of God, we aren't free. We're enslaved to something. Jesus would later say in John chapter 8, anyone who sins is a slave to sin. This was a tax that acknowledged they are in bondage to sin. And therefore, they could not just enter God's presence. God needed to create some way for them to fellowship with him. And so, this tax, first of all, it was a ransom. Secondly, it was a universal tax. It was every adult male over the age of 20. Third, it was a flat tax. He tells Moses, the rich people aren't to pay more and the poor people aren't to pay less. In other words, everybody's debt is the same, no matter who you are. Everybody owes it, and it's the same amount. And finally, he calls this money atonement money. And he says, I want you to take this atonement money, and in chapter 38, he takes that atonement money and he melts it down in this metal becomes the material that they used to build the first tabernacle, which becomes the place of worship. It becomes the place where God's presence dwells. And it is the place where they offer sacrifice. This tabernacle, this building that moved around with Israel, eventually it would graduate into the temple. And so this tax, which at first was just a one-time tax, it became an annual tax in support of the ministry of the temple. That is what these guys were collecting. And it had become a sign of national loyalty back in that day as they lived under Roman oppression. And the month before the Passover, these guys would come around and they would begin to collect this tax. You could either pay the tax the month before to these guys, or you could pay it in person when you got to Jerusalem, which was why, by the way, there were money changers when Jesus got there and he turned the tables over. That's all about this temple tax that was owed. These were good guys. They were faithful Jews. And that is the tax they were collecting. Now, the question is, why were they asking Jesus about it? The reason that they were asking Jesus about this tax, we don't exactly know, but the assumption is this: is your teacher a faithful Jew? Does he support the ministry of the temple? It's a fair question. Do you know why? Because Jesus said some interesting things about the temple. In just a few weeks, do you know what he would say? Destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. That's confusing. In chapter 12 of Matthew, do you know what he said? He said, something greater than the temple is here. See, these guys might be wondering, we're not quite sure where your teacher stands. Does he support the ministry of the temple? Now, Peter, we don't know if he has any inner conflict about this question, but what we see from this passage is that without hesitation, he answers, yes, we pay the tax. He supports the temple and the ministry of the temple. Now, here's how this and where this happens. They are in Capernaum. They are likely at Peter's house. And the picture that we get is Peter has this conversation outside by himself while Jesus and the rest of the disciples are inside. And so after Peter has this conversation, he walks back inside and listen to what Jesus says. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first. The reason that I think Matthew says Jesus spoke to him first was to make the point. Peter didn't start this conversation. He didn't have a question about this. Jesus went out of his way to make sure, hey, I want to speak into the conversation that you just had that I wasn't present for. This is one of those moments where he shows himself to be God because he knows what you just talked about. That's what's happening here. And listen to what he says. He spoke to him first saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth? I'm going to have to start wearing these glasses. All right. He says, from whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? You see what he's asking here? He's saying, Peter, when you have an earthly king, who does he collect taxes from to support the palace and to support the work of the government? It is not his children. It is, the word there is others or strangers. But he doesn't collect a tax from his own blood. See, this is an obvious line of logic that Jesus is following here. He's saying, Peter, if kings' sons, earthly kings, don't pay tax, what about the son of the King of Kings? That's the point that he's making. In fact, this is an acknowledgement that Peter made 2 chapters before in chapter 16. Do you know this awesome story? They come into Caesarea Philippi. He says, who do the people say that I am? And they give him some answers. And then he looks at them and he says, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter pipes up in one of his finest moments and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This was the first time that they gave an accurate and complete answer for who Jesus actually was. And Jesus praised him for it. He's saying, Peter, I am the son of the king, and therefore I don't owe this tax. That is the logic that he's following. But listen, that is not exactly what he says. He says instead, he says, what do you think, Simon? From whom do they? Okay, from their sons or from others. And when he said from others, Jesus said to him, listen, the sons are free. He does not say the son is free, which is what you would expect. He says the sons are free. In other words, Peter, you don't have to pay this tax either. Why? Because when you identify with the Son, you become a son. Not in the same way, but a son nonetheless. Paul would put it this way in Romans chapter 8. We have not received a spirit of slavery that leads again to fear, but a spirit of adoption that causes us to cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit testifies with our own spirit that we are children. And if children, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. He's saying, Peter, because of your identification with me, you share the same status that I have. You're a son. You're not a stranger. You're a son. And therefore, I don't owe this tax, and you don't owe this tax. You are free. Now, why does Jesus go out of his way to make this point? What is he saying that he's free from? Is he just trying to make him understand you don't have to pay this 2 drachma tax? Well, yes, but not just that. What he's saying is, Peter, you're free, not just from that, but from all that that tax represents. See, that tax was in support of the ministry of the temple. That old system of perpetual sacrifice that never produced a single righteous person, which is why they had to keep coming back and continually sacrificing, which is why they had to continue to pay that offering year after year after year, because they never changed, because that system couldn't change them. He says, Peter, you're free from that system. Why? Because I'm bringing a new system. When Jesus said something better than the temple is here, you know what he's saying? That's not the place you worship anymore. That is not where the presence of God is anymore. You know why? Because the presence of God is right here. And you worship right here at my feet. I am the presence of God. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. He dwelt among us. I am the presence of God, and is no longer the place to make sacrifices for your sin. Why? Because I am going to become the once and for all final sacrifice. I am the new and better temple. Now, he goes out of his way to make sure that Peter understands you are free because you're a son. Do you understand your freedom? That you are not declared righteous because of any good thing that you do, but because of what he has done for you. This morning, I think, first part of the message is this: you are free because you are a son and a daughter. If you have received him by faith, you're not under that old system anymore. You don't earn your salvation. It has been purchased for you. He really wants him to get that, which makes it all the more strange that right after he goes out of his way to make that point, he says, now, pay the tax. What is that all about? Let me read it to you, and then I'll tell you what I think. It says, and when he said from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take it and give it to them for me and for yourself. Peter, I don't owe this tax. You don't owe this tax. You're a son. I'm a son. We are free. Now, pay it anyway. I think what Jesus is doing here is he is introducing Peter to a new kind of obedience. Not an obedience in order to be accepted, but an obedience that flows out of the acceptance that we freely have been given. He says, Peter, you're free. Now here's what I want you to do. Lay down your freedom. Why? Because Jesus knew that if they were to exercise their freedom in this particular issue, it would have hindered the advancement of the kingdom that he came to bring. Remember these guys? They were good Jewish men, and they were asking, is your teacher a faithful Jew? The most faithful Jew to ever live. Does he love God more than you know? Does he support the ministry of the temple? It's complicated. Okay. Not in the way that you think. He came to obsolete the temple because he is the new and better temple. Jesus says, just pay the tax. Okay? It's not worth it because us exercising our freedom here is going to send a message that we don't mean to send, and it could hinder the advancement of the kingdom. Jesus invites Peter into a new kind of obedience. It's an obedience where we get to surrender the freedom that we have. And here's the standard by which we make that decision. Will it hinder or advance his kingdom that I'm called to be a partner in advancing? Peter was not obeying to be accepted. He was inviting to willingly lay down a right and a freedom that was his. Can I give you an example of this? For 20 years or so, I was on Young Life staff. And for 13 of those years, I worked with college students. And as you know, college is the time that around late sophomore year or early junior year, do you know what happens? You turn 21. And that is a big year for college students, okay? Especially Christian college students, because they're the only ones actually observing the idea that you're not supposed to drink until you're 21. Everybody else is drinking all the time. But we had a lot of these college students that when they would become 21, we would have a conversation with them. And what we'd say is this: there is no law anymore that suggests that you can't drink. Of course, to get drunk is a sin. But to drink, you have that right now. As a Christian who is 21 years old, you can do that. Now, we'd like you to lay that right down. Why? Because in your exercising of this freedom, Young Life leader, you are going to send a message that you don't intend to send. I promise you. There's not going to be some parent downtown that sees you drinking a beer and thinking, you know what, I bet he's just going to have one and then be the designated driver for the rest of his friends. He's the responsible one. That's not what they're going to think. They're going to think he's just like every other college student. And it won't be true, and it doesn't matter. Would you lay down that freedom? Why? For the sake of the gospel. Who is the best example of this? Other than Jesus, who's the best example of this? The Apostle Paul. What did he say? Am I free as an apostle? Am I free? He said, I'm free, but I make myself a slave to everyone. To the Jew, I became like a Jew. To the Gentile, I became like a Gentile. Why? So that by all possible means, I might save some. I'm willing to lay down the rights that are mine for the advancement of the kingdom that God calls me to partner with him in advancing. This is the new kind of obedience that Jesus has invited us into. Not to be accepted, but from the freedom that he has purchased, for us to say, I give it back. It's yours. Now, the question is, why the miracle? It's such an odd and peculiar miracle. Let's read it again, and I want to tell you 3 reasons that I think this miracle is here. Here we go. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. Let me tell you why I think this miracle is here. 3 reasons. First of all, I think this is a metaphor, first of all, for the kind of obedience that Peter calls Jesus into. He says, take a line and a hook and go catch 1 fish. Peter was a professional fisherman. What does a professional fisherman use? They use a net. They don't bother with a line and a hook. That's how kids fish. In fact, I've been teaching Claire how to fish. It's not true, actually. My 14-year-old neighbor, Emmeline Sorrell, down the street, has been teaching Claire how to fish because Claire's dad doesn't like to touch worms or fish, okay? I just have to be honest with you. I know that in many of your eyes, I'm less of a man, and you know what? In my own eyes as well, that is true. Anyway, the other day I see this happen. Emmeline she puts a worm on a hook and casts the line in, and she catches a fish within like the first 10 minutes. A kid can do this. The call to obey Christ in this way, to lay down the freedom that is yours, it is a humbling way to live. That's number one. That's the first thing that we learn about this kind of obedience that Jesus calls us to. The second is this: it's optional. I'd never had this observation before until I started studying this passage, and here's what it is. This is the only miracle of Jesus that we don't know if it actually occurred. Have you considered that? He tells Peter to do it, but we don't know if he actually does it. We assume that he does. I wonder, for how many of us, are there opportunities out there for you and I to obey? Opportunities that have been extended, followed by miracles that would occur that we're just kind of leaving out there. This is humbling and it is optional. You don't have to obey Christ in this way in order to be saved. You just don't. Let me just say it this way. You don't have to take the mission trip. You don't have to have your quiet time. You don't have to tithe. But he invites you to give of yourself, to lay down your rights for the advancement of his kingdom. And when you do, this is the second point of the miracle. I think this miracle is a metaphor for the miracles that will take place when we enter into this kind of obedience. I just want you to step into Peter's shoes for a second and imagine what he experienced. When he dropped that line, he says, I don't want you to wait until you catch a fish with a coin in its mouth. He says, the first fish you catch will have a fish, and it's going to have the exact amount that you need to pay my tax and your tax. In order for that to have happened, someone would have needed to throw a coin into the sea. Some fish, the fish that Peter would eventually catch, would take it in its mouth but not swallow it all the way into its stomach. It would just be hanging out in its mouth. Peter would catch that fish. The first fish he caught would have that coin. Can you imagine the reward of that for Peter? Let me give you a hint. The reward for Peter was not the coin. It was realizing that Jesus was everything he promised to be for Peter. And when you and I surrender our freedom for Christ's sake, what we get, the reward that we get, is we see him showing himself faithful. I would put it this way. Any one of us who is willing to take him up on this optional offer to obey in this way, we become a candidate to experience the supernatural provision and power of Jesus Christ in our own life. What a gift. And then finally, we'll close with this. I think this miracle is a metaphor for the way that Jesus would purchase Peter's freedom to begin with. You know, the sea throughout the Bible is a picture of God's divine judgment. And in that sea of God's judgment was one fish. It looked like every other fish, but there was something different about this fish. It carried in its body the payment that Peter's sin demanded. It carried in its body the ransom. But the only way to get that ransom to the one that needed it was for that fish to willingly bite a hook that would lead to his death. That when he came up out of that sea, whoever lays hold of that would find life, would find the exact amount that they need for the debt that they owe. You see, this is what Jesus did for Peter. When he says, the sons are free, what is implicit is, and you're only free because I purchased your freedom. Do you know what verse 22 and 23, right before 24 through 27, which we looked at? It says, Jesus told them, I must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and die, but on the third day I'll rise. And then this conversation happens outside Peter's house. That is not a mistake. Jesus wanted Peter to know, I paid a tax I didn't owe, but I'm also going to pay a tax for you that you do, in order that you might be my son, so that you can be free. You see, this obedience that Jesus invites Peter into, he modeled it first. He took an assignment that was beneath him. In the same way that that Peter fished in a way that was beneath him, Jesus took an assignment that was beneath him, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. But he made himself nothing, and he emptied himself. He took on the nature of a servant. In being found in human likeness, he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. See, Jesus walked in these steps first. He took the freedom that was his and he laid it down. Why? For the advancement of the kingdom that he came to bring. The question is, has it come to you? Are you here today as a stranger or as a son? Have you been striving your whole life trying to be good enough so that God would accept you? You never will be. And the good news today is you don't have to be. Because the one that God sent came to be good for you on your behalf. And he was thrown into the sea of God's wrath. And in his body bore the penalty of our sin so that you could be set free. Are you here today as a son? Then here's my invitation to you. You are free. Now lay down your freedom. Why? For the sake of the gospel, that you may share in its blessings. There are coins in mouths waiting for you if you would be willing to trust him and obey in this way. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for how it instructs us and teaches us. But most of all, Lord, thank you for how it reminds us of your gospel, that empty-handed we come. That you have provided the sacrifice and the payment for our sin so that we could be connected to a relationship with you. Lord, I pray that some of us today would choose to obey you in some new ways that are optional, but that certainly will come with a reward. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. Before we stand to sing, we just want to remind you that we have an opportunity now to come and pray with someone else in a unique way. In this back hallway, we have our prayer ministers would love to meet you and pray with whatever's on your heart. Or if you'd like to pray individually, you can come to these rails up here and just spend some time individually between you and God. But for the rest of us, would you please stand as we worship the King?